Thank you very much, everyone, for coming today. This is personally going to be a very interesting event. It was my idea to organize this, and thanks to the Sustainability Week organizers, I've been able to make this happen. And also, I would like to appreciate ETH for being so generous to give me such a good auditorium for these 2 hours that this event will last. So, yeah, the idea was the intersection between Marxism and environmentalism. And my hypothesis in the first case was that these 2 ideas were connected. And how did I end up concluding such a bizarre idea, according to many people? That's something that I'm going to be delving into. And I want to explain a bit that I think you deserve a bit of an explanation of why I'm not being accompanied by anyone here. So the reason is that I've contacted around 40 academics of the fields of social sciences and environmental sciences, and also, yeah, those are the 2 major fields on which I've been focusing, and none of them were available or willing to discuss this topic. I think there's a huge fear of cancellation right now in academia. People are just not willing to touch any topic which could derange their careers, and yeah, I'm willing to do that. I don't think this is too deranging of a topic. I'm just trying to put a hypothesis forward and see what you think. So I've changed my plan a bit. I was thinking of having someone next to me discussing this topic and what my intuitions were about why these 2 ideas are connected. I've studied a bit economics, finance, I've got some background in this field, so I don't come here naked. I have done some research, but not specifically about the connections. This is just an intuition of a guy. So why I believe that these 2 ideas are connected and why I wanted someone else accompanying me is that I wanted some help in other fields in which I might have a blind spot. I do not know a lot about environmental sciences, but having someone who would help me and encompass all the fields conjointly would be very beneficial. And so yeah, I'm just going to give a short speech about why I believe this to be the case, that these 2 ideas are connected, and then I will allow all of you to give your opinion about why this is the case or why it is not the case, that these 2 ideas are connected. I'm not trying to advocate for Marxism or environmentalism or anything. I'm just trying to put forward a hypothesis that these 2 ideas are connected, and in case you agree, disagree, or have any ideas about why there's complete mismatch between these 2 ideas, everything is accepted, so I'm not trying to enforce any idea into you, just sharing my thoughts, and if you agree, perfect, you can share yours as well. Okay, so I've started to believe that there's a spectrum between how much we allow people to act freely in the economy, and there's people in both sides of the spectrum. There's in one extreme the Marxists. That's what this lecture or panel discussion was intended to be about. Those are the people who advocate for the maximum amount of intervention of the state in the economy. So free actors or individuals cannot hold any property of the means of production. That would be the one extreme of the spectrum, in which 0% is held privately. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's the free market anarcho-capitalists like Javier Milei from Argentina. And those are people who advocate for the maximum freedom of the individual being able to establish any kind of project, as long as you obviously follow some minimum rules of respect for other people. That's what I believe, they believe. And so I'm just trying to establish this spectrum so that you can all understand that if you're a social democrat, you're probably in the middle, not in any of the 2 sides of the spectrum. And seeing everything in this one-dimensional spectrum helps understand why it is that politics can be understood in a more general way. There's like a general equation in which you can put some numbers and then it gives you where you are more or less in the spectrum. In the spectrum, I'm just trying to explain. So in the pursuit of a way of organizing society in a way that maximizes flourishing, different people believe different things. And as I said before, Marxists advocate for a minimum amount of freedom from the part of the capitalists. They believe that there's a surplus of exploitation of the workers. So I work, let's say, for a company, and they have a profit from the organizing of the business. and that is believed by Marxists to be bad and something not good. So that's what one side of the spectrum would believe. In the other side, profit is just seen as virtue, so profit equals virtue or goodness in you. If you have been able to provide value to the market, that determines that you're valuable as a person. So those are the two very radical views of politics that exist. And yeah, I started to see some connections between the side of the more intervention of the state in the economy, in that I've heard a lot of speeches by environmentalists and people who advocate for measures which would reduce the amount of damage that humans cause in the earth in the long term. And I've realized that most of them, and not all of them, I must say, advocate for a big amount of intervention of the state in the economy. So the state, according to them, should establish in which ways the market should rule over its resources. So if we are polluting with certain chemicals, then the lake of Zurich, let's say, the state should say whether you can do that or not. And in the other side of the spectrum, we have Harry Milley, who I think would say that if a perfect anarcho-capitalist society would exist, we would have the lake privatized, so you do not want to pollute your own lake, so why regulate whether you can use, put some chemicals in the lake? It's yours, so do you put chemicals into your bed? No, right? So you wouldn't either. So those are the two sides of the spectrum. In one, humans are not very good in managing their own resources. If you allow them to pollute and have externalities, that's bad, and that's why the state should put some regulations over what can be done. And yeah, where I was going with this rambling is that most of the environmentalists, and this is something I would really like to hear your opinion about, that I've heard, advocate for a big amount of intervention by the state in the market, also for higher taxes and other measures which would enhance the amount of tasks that the government has in nudging the market in a certain direction. And this is where my hypothesis comes. I believe that there's a process of natural selection, not only at the level of living beings, but also at the level of ideas. So there's the genes and the memes. Richard Dawkins actually talked a lot about this concept. And the basis on which these things are selected is by how good they are at spreading. And the fitness function, let's say, this is a big word which just says how good you are at spreading, is determined by how attractive you are to potential humans, or I don't know how to describe the channel by which ideas spread. Let's say, yeah, humans are the ones managing ideas. I don't know what other entities could. So if you have an idea, it's very attractive. Humans will think a lot about it and will talk about it, spread it, and that's why this idea is fit. And I've seen a huge nudge change in the left recently, or in the last 5 decades or so, which is not very recent, according to, depending on the time frame you take. But I've seen that there was more of an advocacy for flirting before. The Soviet Union during the Cold War was supposed to beat the US in terms of how much output we could have economically, and the flourishing that we could give to our population based on a centralized planning system would be maximized by having a centralized entity. And that was partially shown to be, or at least in this experiment, which is only a sample of one, so maybe it's not good enough evidence, some people would say, the US was shown to be more good at providing with resources and, in general, human flourishing to people. But then the argument had to be changed. Now we couldn't, if we wanted to advocate for the left or the ideas of more state intervention, the framing of the debate should change. So now it's not pure maximization of well-being that we are trying to, but maybe not well-being, sorry, pure maximization of economical output. That's what capitalism is very good at that. But it's not that which the left or the communist Marxist are trying to maximize. Now that has changed. Now what we are trying to do in the last 3, 4, 5 decades, the narrative has changed towards equity and an ability to provide equally for society, so everyone will have more, and that will, even if we produce less, or there's some scholars, some Marxist scholars, which still claim that centralized planning would lead to more production of products and better products, so it's still on the table, and it's not something that we have been able to definitely conclude. This is not physics. The problem doesn't have, we don't have an analogous problem in economics. We cannot say this is the best model, but I'm just trying to put forward the reasons why that has been changing in their narrative. It was more of a, as I said before, economical output, and it went towards equity and environmentalism. We want to avoid certain externalities that individuals acting freely would lead to. So if you are allowed to do whatever you want freely, you would presumably pollute the lake, and we want to avoid that from happening. And one of the means by which you can do that is by prohibiting you from doing that, and that's in many cases an effective way of doing it. So I just found very interesting this transition from one side of the debate to the other, in which they said from economical output towards equity and the environmental objectives. And the convergence, this connection between environmentalism and Marxism that I've detected could be explained by many as just an echo chamber. So you associate with people who agree with you, and you end up only hearing the ideas of the people who you agree with. But I believe that there's much more deepness here than that. I think that the scientific method tries to get evidence from multiple sources in order to maximize the level of certainty we have over a scenario. So if we see something that we hypothesize is a rotten piece of cheese, we could say this is a rotten piece of cheese, but how do you know that? You've only seen it. Have you also smelled it and touched it? Already tasted it? If you have multiple sources of independent evidence, the level of credulity increases. That's basically the scientific method. So on the one side, there's environmentalists and Marxists claiming that more state intervention in the market is justified. And this is why I believe that the connection between these two ideas cannot be dispatched as just saying it's an echo chamber, people agree with each other, get together, and they like each other. No, it might be much deeper than this. It's just people with different perspectives have come to similar conclusions, and this deserves analysis. This is something that deserves us paying attention to it more than just saying these people are crazy and believe some things, which I'm not trying to make a case either for or against these ideas. As I said in the beginning, I'm just trying to synthetically put forward the idea that these two ideas are connected. And as I said before, the amount of freedom we would be willing to give to individuals acting in the market depends on our political leanings. So, as I said, I'm always making reference to Haremile because it's the person who's the most well-known politically, who's in the extreme side of the spectrum, in the, I don't know which direction to point to, maybe you're right. He would advocate for exactly or opposite of what I'm trying to argue. I'm just trying to now explain a bit of a different angle in which these political and economical decisions are substantiated. The degree to which we believe that individuals acting freely would lead to flourishing for society determines how much we would end up trusting them. And there's a very interesting index called the Economic Freedom Index, which registers according to some variables that they like analyzing, and they do some averages, some other averages of this, and they try to rank the countries based on how economically free they are. And I like equalizing this to how much trust society gives to individuals acting freely. I think that economic freedom and how much we believe that individuals acting freely in the economy would lead to flourishing, those two things can be equated. And So yeah, Switzerland, just in case you are curious, is a top 2 in the world in academic freedom. And some of the ones in the bottom are Cuba, Zimbabwe, North Korea, just in case you are curious of what kind of spectrum we're talking about. So that's the spectrum. And some people will argue that the reasons why these countries are put in that manner is biased, and that there's some influence of colonization, and that's certainly true. But yeah, I've got many friends who are environmentalists or, let's say, left-leaning oriented, and they generally believe that if you allow people to do things freely, they would end up doing things that are bad for everyone or even for themselves in the long term. And this is why I'm trying to put forward a spectrum in which I explain that the proclivity of people determining that state mandates are good depends on where you are positioned in this spectrum. And one side, Marxism, in the other one, you will have anarcho-capitalism. But this is more or less irrelevant, and maybe I should be focusing more in how I believe that environmentalism and Marxism are connected. So one more argument that I would like to touch on is that environmentalism is basically the study of negative externalities. So if let's say, I'm here and I fart, that would be a negative externality for all of you, because you are now having to smell it, and that's something that you really do not want to. And that, according to certain people, would be best ruled over or organized by state mandate. So you cannot really excrete things and have other people non-voluntarily have to deal with that. We have to rule over how much people are capable of making others suffer the consequences of their behavior. And the environmentalists, some of them, and I should make exceptions here, generally argue that if you allow free enterprise to occur, it would lead to contamination and negative externalities, and this is why the state has to intervene in a way to reduce the amount of negative externality. So potentially a policeman would come here and say it is prohibited to fart in public, so you should. This is a ridiculous example, and I'm not trying to trivialize at all the serious matter that is the potentiality of contaminating the Lake of Zurich, for example. That's one of the biggest catastrophes I could think of. And I'm trying to put some humor into the matter because this is very serious. But really, take my word seriously in that externalities are a very, very serious matter on which we shouldn't be maybe joking and making a disfavor to the whole field of economics when doing that. But yeah, it's a serious matter, and whether you believe that people could arrange themselves voluntarily to minimize that or not depends on your political leanings. And yeah, those are why I believe this to be the case. But now I should introduce some other caveat into the argument, in that not all of the environmentalists argue for more state intervention in the economy. There's some huge exceptions. I've had the pleasure of knowing some people who do so, and these people would just argue that if you allow people to be free and you try to advocate for environmentally friendly measures, not trying to obligate them to change their behavior, it will lead to more well-being in the long term while not having to force anyone to do anything. So taking into account that there's a group inside of the environmentalist collective that does not advocate for more state intervention, given that I put the whole economical spectrum into one dimension, into how willing you are to have the state intervene on whether we can interact freely or not, I would say that this is why I have found some connection and maybe just the sector of the environmentalist movement. This was more or less the whole case I wanted to make, and I would like to hear your opinions. I've got some microphones here, but I can give it to you, so in case you guys have any thoughts on this, you can share them. So is there anyone who has any maybe 4 protagonist opinion. I was supposed to be having the pleasure of counting with the assistance of my friend Yuki, but she seems to not have come, so I'll be the one counting the microphones, okay?
Or we can just speak very loudly, no?
Okay, we speak loudly? Yes? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so thanks for the talk. I think this is sort of an interesting having these sort of people for these hypotheses and discussing them in a group, I think is interesting. I do think that by kind of taking this single dimension of Marxism and capitalism, you kind of, I would argue, conflate people with strong regulationist tendencies versus people with strong opposition to private property. I kind of think that like these two movements could definitely be parallel, and maybe through this is where you're arguing your connection is, but I think at least the dominant strand in the environmental movement is very much more this sort of strong regulationist trend where this economic freedom for enterprise for like the individual or for small groups is still permitted, but a much stronger regulation is spent towards larger corporations or specific industries is more kind of the main point. I mean, there are definitely green left parties and ideas out there, but I think that the case would be stronger towards more regulation spend personally. I guess, well, your sort of thoughts on sort of this sort of interpretation of the structure you put forward instead of your hypothesis.
Let me try to streamline the argument. So this way we can make sure that I understood what you were trying to make reference to. So I think you were saying that there's different people making emphasis on different facets of the economy, and some people would argue for regulating which kind of ways you can organize your business, while they would argue that private property of the means of production would be something perfectly acceptable. That would be kind of a closer to a social democrat, while they obviously do not advocate for expropriation of the means of production. Is that where you were going?
That's in the direction, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think I agree with you, and my section, if you think of it, I don't know, if in a different way you could encompass what you were mentioning. So how you can rule over your private property would be a mandate which would restrain your freedom less than if you do not own the means of production, let's say. So it would be just a matter of adjusting how much your ability to act in the economy has been restrained. If you can really put a number into that, you could put it into the spectrum. But I agree with you that there's a lot of people advocating for different measures, and maybe putting it into a single dimension would be naive if you are not able to do this
Sort of analysis mapping or PCA, if you will. Yeah, if I could just have one short follow-up, and I guess perhaps more fundamental question is you kind of reference a connection between the two, and I was wondering if you could, maybe I just not understanding something quite well here, if you could kind of formalize what that specific connection is, or is just a sort of parallel school of thought that you're sort of highlighting? Is there some sort of specific thought connection aside from just more state intervention, or is that sort of the kind of thing you're highlighting, they're both moving in this direction?
They're both moving, well, I don't know if they are moving in that there's a thought which hasn't changed that much in the last few decades, in the last 10 years or so. I wouldn't be able to give you a precise time frame in which these things wouldn't have changed that much, but the reason why I see this overlap is that I see a huge overlap in the kinds of beliefs that people hold. So this would be similar to the religiosity of people. So if you go to Spain, where I come from, the odds of someone being a Catholic are incredibly high. Now, it is becoming atheist or secular at a huge speed, but the odds of you finding, given that someone is religious in the street, the odds of them being Christian Catholic would be very high. And why is that the case? Is it because you reason about your beliefs from a first principles perspective? Were you trying to analyze your environment and derive the truth in a very scientific way? Or have you just gathered the information from what other people believe? I would say it's the second one more so than the first one. But we cannot really think from first principles in all of the cases. And why I'm trying to make reference to the religiosity in Spain and any other place in the world, really, is that there's a correlation between the region of origin and the kind of religion that you uphold or you believe in. And the same thing happens with so many other beliefs. So if you are against vaccines, you also probably held other kinds of beliefs which are close to those, and there's a huge overlap, as I said before, between the people who believe one thing and others. So the odds of you believing thought number 2, given number 1, is very high. And given number 3, the chances of number 1 maybe are very low. So that's where I was claiming that, that's where I come from, to claim that these two are connected.
Okay. I have other stuff, but I'll circle back with you.
Okay.
Yeah. I wanted to speak about economic democracy per se. Right? I mean, like, we have an electoral system in many countries, but the decision-making process of, especially when it relates to economics and policy in many different aspects, is increasingly out of the government and into the hands of private sector. So this is one problem that has happened. Like, for example, in the UK, water services are entirely privatized, and they decide how to supply water to who, how much of that to clean and what kind of effluent to leave into the river Thames, depending on their shareholder interest rather than the interest of the people at large. Right? What is democracy ultimately? Democracy is rooting the will of everyone, the common people especially, into governance. Right? Now, you are turning that into a kind of Athenian democracy where it is a democracy of shareholders instead. When you take more and more parts of the economy and put it in the hands of the private sector. So this is one issue. The second issue is heavy accumulation that happens among a few big families or few big shareholders. That gives those people so much power. What has electoralism turned into? Electoralism has now turned into a context of who has maximum funds to contest elections. You and I, we can have the best policy program possible, but we cannot get it out to as many people as we can because we are limited in our funds. But a party like FDP can literally hire tons of people to go to everybody's house to send out their policy program. Right? So electoralism is a fight of who has how much money. And when this money and capital gets accumulated among a few people, electoralism also sways in that direction. So you have a double whammy. You're limiting the space of thought of people to vote in a certain direction. At the same time, you're taking more and more things out of the will of people and putting in the hands of few shareholders. Mm-hmm. So it goes much deeper than that. That's what I wanted to say.
Maybe to circle back to your discussion, basically this is the argument for socialism, right? Mm-hmm. And what's interesting, what I didn't know the term environmentalism, is that instead of saying this sucks because the little people are victimized, you change the argument and you say it's not about the little people anymore, it's the planet is victimized. It does an even more abstract idea that we can defend, and it makes everyone a bad person in the end, like because we're all living this by existing. There's this one idea of a friend of mine not wanting to have children because children produce CO2. Right? At the end, humanity is the wrong to Earth. And so it's just another angle. I think that's okay for currently.
Absolutely. I want to frame this as an open discussion in which if anyone wants to intervene and counter-argue something that other of you have said, feel free to do that. I'm not the one monopolizing the responses, so if anyone has something to say, just do so.
I think maybe going off that and just sort of what you're sort of saying in terms of not just little people who are victimized, but also the planet victimized, actually, I would disagree there, particularly from a sort of Marxian perspective. First of all, to the question tonight, Marx and environmentalism isn't linked. Marx, in The Capital itself, in the book, already in the late 1800s, very specifically says one of the fundamental issues of capital is continuous accumulation. Continuous accumulation creates more resources, which leads to environmental degradation. So he, in The Capital, did already foresee what would eventually happen. Now, what I would sort of say within the sort of modern environmental movement, but also where a lot of these sort of environmental thinkers are going, is to sort of say one of the big issues that we have in terms of home economics, in terms of talking about liberalism in the environment, the UN London definition, this sort of new concept of green growth, is that we still take the individual alone without taking so to take as aware what is really the injustices in this system. One of the primary injustices of our modern system, like that capitalism exploits, and that came out of feudalist system, is class. But I think what you're going into in terms of democratizing the workplace is one of the fundamental key ideas, which a lot of environmental economists, especially on the right-wing side, say that we need to re-democratize the workplace. We need to acknowledge class and class injustices, and we need to, through democratizing the workplace, giving workers true power of fields of production, then allowing them to decide what is to be produced and what do we produce things for. Do we produce things to continuously grow GDP, or do we produce things to really benefit human welfare and the use value, if you want to put it, of goods themselves? Right? And I think that's sort of one of the key aspects that sort of needs to be brought into it, and sort of a modern ecological Marxist would argue on the line of saying we need to see class. And then class is a very good document itself. Also within that, there's obviously sexism, feminist critique of growth and capitalism as well. That needs to be captured into this pretty David alluded to outright. So I think that's an element of it. So I would argue strongly that Marx and technology are very closely linked, have always been, for sort of forgotten many decades since. And there's a lot of modern scholars who are now rebuilding these connections. But also the fact that this is also one of the fundamental ways in terms of criticizing green growth, the capitalist neoliberal sort of vision of how we actually come out of the climate crisis and how we actually re-empower workers and actually become emissions.
I think I heard a slightly different emphasis in you. What you said is very pertinent to what he was saying, but I think there was also another aspect which he didn't fully address, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, in that I remember my friend Phil once said that the two-party system in many of the countries in the West is analogous to the two wings of a single bird, just walking in the same direction, and it's trying to perpetuate itself. So there's a lot of inertia in the systems. Power tries to perpetuate itself, and in that sense, I think you're absolutely right. I think you weren't fully aware of this from what I was able to interpret from your thoughts.
I think you make a good case, but I think that the connection you draw between environmentalism and Marxism is not on a fundamental level. It is on the level of state interference in the economy, which is, I think, not really getting at the heart of the issue. Because I think if you look at, and I think what actually you said plays into the heart of the issue, which is how much do we trust individuals, which goes back to a further point, which is about humanism, and whether the planet is victimized or not by humanity. So what kind of view do we have of humans? Are they consumers and destroyers of the planet, which is what you get with the environmental footprint, as though humans were destroyers and not productive, creative humans who do good, And in fact, I would disagree. Marx was one of the first opponents of the environmentalist movement, because if you look at the history of the environmentalist movement, it starts with Thomas Malthus and his ideas on population in the late 18th century. And what Thomas Malthus basically argued, and this is where the modern environmental movement grew out of, which is the idea that population grows geometrically and the means of feeding them grows arithmetically, and that at some point the laws of nature will intervene and produce famine, pestilence, plague, and war to reduce the human population. And what Malthus was basically arguing, this position, is that there are natural limits to human prosperity and flourishing, and that poverty is something natural. Malthus naturalized poverty. And Marx called that, in his letter to Proudhon, or on Proudhon rather, a lampoon on the human race. Because, you find it in Malthus's book where he actually says, if the poor knew that their poverty was natural, and they should just stop breeding like rabbits, they would be happier in their poverty. And Marx said, no, it is a social problem, a political problem we can actually solve. These are not natural events, they are social and political. And if you look at the modern environmentalist movement, which precisely grew out of this neo-Malthusianism, which was prevalent in the 60s, that collapsed. Because, as we all well know, the world has many more people than ever before, and much more food than ever before, and food actually increased geometrically the ability to feed ourselves. So they pivoted to something else. They pivoted to CO2 and natural limits, which have become grown. The resources are going to go away. We'll have more oil and gas and so on. And then you have CO2 and climate change because the gas thing also seems to be wrong. But the point I would make is, if you look at that particular aspect of it, Marxism was always in favor of man conquering nature, of exploiting the natural world for our own benefit. They have no part about it. If you look at Trotsky, their models and ours, he said the object of Marxism is to increase the power of man over nature and decrease the power of man over man. And the first thing Lenin wanted to do after the socialist revolution, he said, well, this is the Stalinist idea, well, Stalinism is corruption, Leninism. Lenin wanted to increase the factory production. That's the first thing he wanted to do, set up loads and loads of factories. This modern environmentalism, Marx is turning it in his grave, all these environmentalists in socialist parties and Greeks who think themselves on the left, they are inimical to the left-wing idea. Because Marx loved capitalist growth and loved industry and didn't think, because again, as a last sentence, I would say, actually, environmentalism is this idea that poverty is natural and that we can't grow too much because otherwise it's an excuse for poverty. Stay poor because otherwise the world will be destroyed. That's basically what they're telling us.
Yeah, I think an observation here to go back on the connection between the two. And when you say environmentalism, there's a lot of attitudes towards environmentalism. You ask 5 environmentalists in demonstration, in which give you a different interpretation, right? I would reduce them to 3 main ways of thinking. One, you could have it in this Marxist way that there is an elite, a privileged elite, that consumes the resources of the world, of the planet, for their own benefit, to amass more wealth, more power, more everything. And an environmentalist is opposed to that, is intending them to redistribute, is intending them to stop, to slow down. Then you have maybe this second way of thinking, where you expect it to be the resources and our growth are in a zero-sum game. So our geometric growth is at some point going to be stopped by the limited resources, and there's going to be famines and wars and so on. So usually what people present in this way of thinking is that we should reduce our footprints, we should reduce our consumption, and we cannot accept a larger population, a larger or a better way of life even. So maybe we should all go back to big houses and live a village life. Then you have a third way of thinking, which is more that technology can actually turn this out of a zero-sum game into an open game. So you can always find more ways to feed more people and get ways to give everybody a good lifestyle without having to curtail the luxuries that we take for granted, and more and more people in the world could one day take for granted. So that's maybe more technological approach. I would say Marxism is only akin to the first approach, and probably the people who think in terms of class struggle against this elite somehow inspired from those ideas, or at least socialist ideas. And it has its merit as well. I don't think this is my personal view. I think it's important to redistribute. There should be some cap on wealth, on control of resources. But it has to be well defined. How do you redistribute them? To whom and how you decide. But the other two, I would say, don't have so much to do with Marxism. It's just other currents of thought, which are also in environmentalism, and in my view are more important. Because that's where you have solutions.
I think you are making reference to something with which I deeply agree. I think that the ultimate resource is human ingenuity. So in business, there's a concept called bottleneck. And if you have a lot of costs, no matter what you do, if you are not having more income than your cost, there will never be a profit, no matter how much you scale your business. But what I'm trying to go here is that human ingenuity is the solution to any bottleneck. Or that's at least, I've been very influenced by David Deutsch, and he's a physicist. He wrote at the beginning of infinity, and he said that if something is not prohibited explicitly by the laws of nature, it is impossible. And I think that's very in line with your very optimistic view that humans thinking and optimizing the process of production ultimately could lead to anything being solved. And now the argument, the next step would be to conclude whether centralized or decentralized power would be the way forward, and that's something that it's a matter of debate.
To jump in there. Yeah, I was just wondering about the definition of Marxism that you had in the beginning, because I think you started to state interventionism, and then I think one could argue that it's not really Marxism because that very well works within a capitalist system, which is probably nowadays environmental regulation and enhancing innovations to innovate output of probably environmental emissions from economic activity. This is one line of thought. But then, at least according to the book that I read, I think the line that I had before, is that if there are limits to this decoupling, and I mean you can argue about that, then of course you cannot keep on growing and as such providing for the workers, the working class, giving them better lifestyles while capitalists accumulate more. I think that's just kind of the main line of the eco-Marxists scene. That is, I think that would probably be more the Marxist view that in that they argue this decoupling is not possible. So therefore we have to find a way, a new economic system in which we redistribute resources in a way that probably would not be capitalistic, because capitalistic accumulation just leads to growth and you don't get around this. So I think this as a amplification perhaps of these line of thoughts, but then you can argue about it as not convinced to be either with myself. But yeah, just to put that point there, can reflect on that.
I think your point is extremely pertinent. You're absolutely right that in order to be able to discuss about a topic, we should be able to define what we're talking about. And maybe I didn't do that precisely now. And why I claim that Marxism is analogous to state intervention is just that I see in the spectrum of how much state intervenes in the economy, the extreme as being Marxism, and in the other one, anarcho-capitalism. So you're right, and I would like to achieve some consensus, or at least some kind of agreement in the room of what we mean by both sides of the spectrum. So what is capitalism and what is Marxism or socialism, which according to some scholars those two terms are not interchangeable, but let's say that there's a spectrum. And so how would anyone have any ideas of how to start defining capitalism, and maybe you can build on that to be able to have a more rigorous debate?
Not really.
I mean, free capitalism would be the accumulation of profits and the reinvestment of those profits to expand production. That's sort of the basic classic capitalism, and you can focus on efficiency. So, yeah. And then Marxism, on the other hand, I'm wary of trying to find a consensus on Marxism because you can have a room of Marxists and they can spend a weekend debating what is Marxism. But I would generally, in a generalized version, sort of say that Marxism is the recognition of economic history as stages of history, capitalism being one stage, a crucial stage of human history, through which productive capacity of the state is built out. Until then, there is the violent overthrow of said state by a vanguard, or then you say vanguard, as a Marxist would say, a general uprising of the working classes to take over the means and production of that state. I think that pushes that goes that it is the overthrow of the state. I also agree, I would say, in terms of state interventionism, I wouldn't necessarily call Marxism is a sort of classic system or socialism, because Marxism wouldn't see it as state intervention in the market because the state would be controlled and run by the workers, right? So they would then find their own infrastructure.
Could just actually, I don't want to do this hash out the definition of Marxism. I just one thing, when you say kind of the state control means production, are we saying groups of workers control their factories, or are we saying more of a centralized command economy? And how?
I think again, this is the point, like, it's got a long time.
Yeah, exactly.
How it actually was, obviously, we know the classic example of communism, so Soviet Union, although I wouldn't really call that communist or Marxist, is that it is centralized control of resources and the definition of the planet economy, where resources go. I would say that was a sort of practical corruption of Marxism because they needed to do something. For me, personally, it would be workers controlling the factories themselves and deciding themselves along a wider democratic basis, using tools like citizens' assemblies, things like that, of how to produce waste workers.
Yeah, and I guess if I can add on this now, just with that definition, which is kind of the one, I guess I tried to allude to my opening comment, I can see that as sufficiently decoupled from the regulationism your original hypothesis rested on, such that I would consider them sort of two distinct lines of thought. Like this working definition is closer to the one that I understood. I see these two things as different enough, where yes, you could say there's a connection, or if you kind of putting in the direction more of a correlation, but in terms of the foundational principles they want to work towards, I would say they're sufficiently distinct. But I mean, if your thesis is that they are connected, I mean, I think that's a safe position to defend, because they do have some like the same objectives in some senses, and they're connected in this way. But in terms of debating the merits, you could argue those are two competing ideas. I think in a pretty strong way.
So to the degree to which Marxism counts with the state as being part of the capitalist system, if we accept that as the definition of how the economy works, we would need one more dimension. It's not just the single dimension of state intervention, because the degree to which the state intervenes is just part of the capitalist system. The state and the market collaborate to create a capitalist system, according to what I think you were mentioning. Am I right?
Wasn't quite sure where you're going, but maybe sort of building up what you're saying as well. Is I think yes, and again, this is where socialism comes in as a separate sort of element from Marxism, where socialism would work within the system to overthrow the system through revolutionary reformism, skills of sort of definition of Rosa Luxemburg, and yeah, that would then be a more of a state interventionist in that sort of classic sense. And then there's degrees of how you could do it. You could do it by state interventionist, which is, I would say, modern social. So what modern social democratic movement tries to do, and then democratic socialism could turn around, which would be much more radical state intervention to them, empower the workers to then create the modern utopia of Marxism.
Even Marx considered the state to be one means of which oppression can occur towards the people or the population. So depending on how the state is managed, it would be in accordance to the Marxist values.
I mean, I'm not a Marxist scholar, so it's not like my specialism. But I mean, certainly, Marx, to my knowledge, didn't write a great deal around regarding how exactly a Marxist state would look like. That's also why decades later, there's a lot of debates around is Lenin right, is Trotsky, how they interpreted it. It was left the Roman rule interpretations. I mean, we can go into that interpretation debate if you want, but I wouldn't feel comfortable saying Marx said this is about the state.
No, I think there's basically an entire website dedicated to this, Marxist.org, where you just kind of have the different streams of this whole thing, which is interesting reference.
Yeah. I think two points I take from Marx. One is always the class struggle. So there's a notion that there are us who are noble and somewhat victim to the system, and then who are accountable for this mess and who must be overthrown, who must be set right, who must be removed from control. So there's always this notion, this struggle. And I think this is one element if you want to discuss Marxism, that's always there. And it happened in a time which I think it's now makes Marxism somewhat obsolete, because at that time there was not really a middle class. There was just the rich people and the exploited workers and the peasants and so on. Today we, at least in the West, live in an industrialized society where you have a large middle class, a small percentage of poor people for sure, and also a very wealthy elite as well. But most of that middle class has a relatively comfortable life. They can have a job and can get all the comforts, and that it itself provides. So just to say that there is one element of Marxism which I always associate with Marxism, this struggle, and that, in my view, it's somewhat outdated in the context of industrial societies. The other element is internationalism. So, whereas capitalism could see countries as sovereign and a country to take care of its own economy and then compete with other economies, in Marxism, the idea is that you have an international front of people who think the same way. Our communists, our Marxists are struggling to overthrow this, not in your state, but across the entire world. That's also, of course, we can transition that to environmentalism, because people also think in terms of the planet and think in terms of what is our contribution to the entire world, not just land.
I have one interesting point when you were trying to frame two entities, the Marxist position. When you wanted to make that framing and then work out what connections might be environmentalism to Marxism, I thought what's interesting happening there is that there's a sort of a structural difference between a capitalist approach, which is contract-based, it's decentralized, and the opposite end of that is a centralized process. In the case of a decentralized process, you have a contract to hold things together, right? And in the mathematics of contracts, no contract is truly complete. So that's a really important ontological difference between these two positions. And when you want to then understand why environmentalism might be more attractive to the centralized decision-making process, I think it's an interesting thing to speculate that there are certain sorts of decisions that we want to take, but we don't want to debate. We don't want to have this method of signing a contract and getting an agreement, and then if there's a notional breach, that we would then debate the answer. We rather have this belief that there are certain sorts of processes that we want arbitrated by a higher power. And that, I think, is the attractiveness of it. Because precisely, if we discovered that none of us could come up with a single definition of Marxism, no one would have a single definition of what was to mean either. That was also debated. And so we sort of come to an understanding that there are certain things that we don't want to be decided contractually. And that is the cultural affinity between environmentalism and Marxism. But that's bold, okay? But it's worth speculating. So all I'm going to say is that there might be a sense in which to understand this test, we want to go down to some mechanistic process. And the key mechanistic difference is that contracts work well, but are incomplete, whereas authority simply works.
Why? Because I say so.
All right, yeah.
Interesting.
So that would be how I would approach understanding such an mechanism, based on this mechanistic underpinning of what's going on, because people instinctively understand how difficult it is for people to agree about something. And if they can rather write it down once and apply it, they feel that they've got a better chance of getting this thing wrong.
What happens here, I think, is that the unit of selection augments. Instead of being you or me in a contractual basis who determine what is done, now the authority is another entity. Let's say, we could do the same thing in business. Let's say there's a company which is subsidizing another one, and if this second company has losses, there's the feedback of the market will not determine if flourishing or perishing, because it's subject to the bigger one on top of it. So if we are ruled by authority, by an entity who says that something should be done, then it is not you or I who are determining what is done, but that entity.
Well, yeah.
So if you are able to surrender and behead the government, then what is done would be upward. But it wouldn't be on you or I whether something is done, but on that higher entity.
Yeah, I mean, and after all, well, Marx was, as we discussed earlier, Marx was also an author. And some of the amazing value of it was to put a lowercase a on authority. The fact that he could write a very powerful and convincing narrative. Well, also backed by the best capitalist theory of capital we've ever had, and it's clearly not surpassed by any of the attempts by economists to exceed that. Their attempts are embarrassing compared to the empirical remarks.
That's good, what you
Found a lot of parallels between what you were saying and all of the social justice movements that currently are, let's say, close to the mainstream. Either the anti-racist movement, the feminist, or the LGBT rights movement. All of these framings have something in common, which is the oppressed versus oppressor. And in the same thing has been applied to the conflict between Israel and Palestine, and Russia and Ukraine. And this unidimensional analysis, I think, in some cases fails, because who couldn't say that there's things being done wrongly in both sides of many of the conflicts in the world? So the unidimensional analysis sometimes is faulty while pointing to some truths in some of the cases. And how is it that we are going to allow for another dimension in this analysis, which if we just use unidimensional analysis like I was trying to do in establishing the political spectrum, if we use the oppressor versus oppressed unidimensional analysis for any of the social interactions, we will conclude that the woke movement is the best thing in the world, while I could clearly point to a lot of deficits in them, while some of the points they make could be argued to be positive. So, do you guys have any thoughts on this?
By the way, I don't defend the unidimensional analysis, of course. I say also about Marxism, struggle, nationalism, etc. Of course, they rejected the private property and distribution. They argue for the distribution. I think if your question is environmentalism, for example, what can they learn from Marxism? Then for sure you can extract some important lessons and some tactics, some approaches, such as indeed the redistribution, that we all take responsibility for the environment, we all contribute for it. Nationalism as well, that the movement is working cross borders, that the message is bigger than one single nation. These kind of things, and also to work on the field, on the ground. So Marx was really struggling there with the workers, organizing strikes and that kind of thing. So that's also one way that environmentalism progresses, with the activists and the people demonstrating. So a lot of things could be learned from there, from that source, and from other sources as well. Like I mentioned, also technology has one contribution for environmentalism and so on. So I would say, of course, multidimensional. And you can learn from Marxism those ways, like you said. You can get some truths in the middle of everything that comes with it. Insight. And the same for the other movements, and racism, etc.
Yeah, I think we have a tremendous amount of lack of healing the abilities to do. So even if you disagree with someone, the inability to point to something on which they are right is a clear evidence of the lack of nuance in the debate. And in most of the cases, everyone has something right. And not being able to discern, for example, was Hitler a good painter? Probably yes. That the fact that he's not considered to be homogeneous linguist, to be a horrible person, shouldn't enable us to separate the art from the artist. And this is something that is not done in a lot of the debates. If you position yourself in one of the sides in the Israel-Palestine conflict, in 90% of the cases, the other side is seen as evil. And there's more nuance in that, and I couldn't agree more with you.
Just to throw in here, I mean, strong case has been made. I think the person who just left was up there, that Marx's analysis in the capital of Das Kapital of capitalism was very good, on very high level. So I would say on that basis, I don't think we can dimensional. But if you want to say that there are particular leftists, Marxists today who are woke, and their problem is they can't see good in others, which is true, absolutely. They are authoritarian, they're dogmatic, and they're upholding the orthodoxy with censorship and all that. Of course they are. We know this. But the point about Marx is, if you look at the thing you would think is the most hardline Marxist text, the Communist Manifesto, in there you have absolutely Marx saying, yes, capitalism has good things. It lifted the masses out of the rural poverty and their rural idiocy. It constructed miracles greater than the Egyptian pyramids. It has brought immense wealth and things we never thought possible. He praises it. So this idea that Marx, if we want to talk about Marxism, cannot recognize the good in the things criticizing, that is not the case. He did. The problem was it wasn't good enough. So that seems pretty nuanced to me. And I would say, perhaps, I think the racism, homophobia, transphobia, all this, which is unidimensional, in that sense, is not Marxist at all. And also because, of course, because what the woke are, I think we'll agree, in a sense it's what I think Rob Henderson calls neo-racism, because they reduce everything to skin color, which is completely divorced, sex or gender, things like that, which is completely divorced from class. Yes. And in that sense, they have removed themselves from what one might call traditional Marxism, to the extent that one can call into question whether they're Marxist at all these days. It's perhaps also this idea of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King said, let's get beyond black and white, let's resolve the difference, not cement them. And Marx had a similar idea. Let's get beyond working class and the bourgeoisie, let's abolish them. So, but today they want to cement it and keep it in place. They have no greater universal students' ambitions. These neo-racist.
Maybe that's a trade-off that we are always forced to deal with when we want to maximize the fitness of ideas. So the spreadability of an idea might be inversely correlated with how nuanced it is. If you make more nuance, if you put more nuance into the debate, it can infect less people, and that's why making a boiled down version of it could be more good at spreading.
The argument that you made regarding the spreadability of idea and how that associates with how fit the idea is, I want to disagree, present a disagreement to that. In many places, the free market dogma and corporate control over everything that land has been imposed through colonialism. I mean, like for example, let's take India for that matter. When India became independent, it didn't become independent by the rule of the people. It was an alliance of the monarchies that existed there and the industrialists who were under British patronage who made India independent. What kind of independence do you call when those who were surviving on Western capital were given the reins to a new nation? This is one example, right? So, which is why you can see extreme inequality in that place, and this is not today. It's been existing since a long time. And even in the modern era, like Brazil under Bolsonaro's rule, which was Bolsonaro's party was funded by American capital, like companies that would like meat supplying companies, for example, or animal feed companies, for example. They funded his campaign tremendously, and as soon as he won, he just handed over pristine Amazon rainforests to those companies. But when the opposite party came in, it cancelled the previous contracts and then protected more rainforests. Right. So the elephant in the room is how much power can an individual amass in a system that they can change the governance system itself. Divorce the governance system completely from the interests of the planet, interests of the people. Right? That's the elephant in the room, I suppose. And
it has little to do with the ideology, right? It's the same in the communism, capitalism, etc. You have individuals who concede resources and advantages to whoever is giving them personally benefits. Like in Saudi Arabia, for example. It's not a democracy, but they gain a lot from receiving the oil to whoever buys them.
Yeah.
And their people suffer as well, right? So I would separate that, it's just power game. I would separate it from the ideology.
So you're saying that this is not my points, but if I could understand what you're saying, you're kind of saying that, oh no, I've lost my train of thought. That the politics of power is independent of an ideology. You can amass resources by means of using ideology instead of the currently exists.
Yeah, you always have this kind of uses. Yeah, and the people who struggle is and the elite who takes advantage.
The House of South family was placed over there by American imperials. So, it's power in many places is also concentrated to a few families because of colonial reasons, not because the idea is particularly suitable to the people over there.
Well, for sure, most of the people could imagine a better life, but they are not able to implement it, right? Because they're oppressed in a way.
This is also where I see Marxism and the Marxist fugitive analysis as an organizing principle, right? And I think the understanding of power, I think it's very careful if you try to separate power from the discourse around Marxism, right? Because that's one of the key principles of Marxism, is to identify power and abuses of power within a system, right? And taking also why, yes, Marx didn't disagree with Malthus, right, on what he said, because Malthus victimized the poor, whereas Marx says, no, we need to empower the poor. This is also where going on to one of your points, 2 points ago, when you were talking about what modern environmentalism can do to Marxism. I think a lot we learned from Marxism in a more updated modern form. This is a 150-year-old ideology. I mean, you don't think that stuff. But one of the key things that we can learn from environmentalism is the understanding of abuse, injustices within the current economic system, understanding who is oppressed by whom within the system. You brought up colonialism, you've got examples of neocolonialism, the extractive capitalist economy nowadays. This is where Jack, you said earlier about Malthus being the birth of modern environmentalism. Yes, there are certain links in the 60s and 70s that often get sort of thrown at environmentalists, especially at that time, in those original limits of growth, where one of the right-wing critiques of limits of growth was to say, oh, you just want less people, right? One of the fundamental things that Marxism can bring us, it doesn't think it has to, but also many other ideologies, is sort of look into power, distributions of power, the class system, and how to create equal and just society, is to say the fact that at the moment, too few people consume too many of the resources. We've already now produced enough resources for the world's population. It is just not distributed fairly. And that brings back to the original point with Marxism as a mobilizing principle, right? This wasn't actually Marx itself, very much. I mean, yes, he wrote the Communist Manifesto very rapidly in 1848 to correspond with revolutions that were kicking off. He needed some template. But this was really brought forward by the German Socialist Party in the late 1800s. We really carry this forward as a sort of template towards revolution, template towards the overthrow of the state, right? And this is the organizing principle of organizing the working classes to them as a collective have means of power.
Yeah, I'd just be curious what people think then about the role of middle class that you mentioned earlier, because if we're now talking about power, it was very much phrased as the oppressed versus the oppressors, which is very two-sided, and I'm not sure how to picture the role of the middle class in there. Also linked to consumerism. If we're consuming something, we don't want to say it's down to the individual, it's not environmental footprint. How do you fit that into this picture of oppressed versus an oppressing power? Like you consume something from an oppressor that is then affecting this.
So I say it's kind of about that in Marxism.
Yeah.
I honestly think that release and really back on this subject itself, that's one of those topics which Marxists nowadays can spend hours debating back and forth and discussing a lot. I mean, I would argue classic Marxism, back when he originally wrote the book, I can't remember mentioning it, but said that those times very small middle class. Classic Marxism would argue the middle class is a tool of the capitalist system. They are the petit bourgeoisie. They are just as much the enemy. And I mean, Mao took that to the extreme definition of saying they are the enemy, right? Because they enable the owners of capital to execute their power and abuses over the working classes. Where that is nowadays, honestly, I don't think the middle class as a definition really can cover it. In that sort of way, I think you have to break up the definition of middle class and understanding where it's also, again, along race, ethnicity, gender, all those sort of things. There are different layers of abuses that you can suffer within the current system. And
I would make it.
Yeah, I guess so. To touch upon I'll touch on that point in a moment, but just wanted, you mentioned like the birthplace of modern environmentalism, which is one of my points I wanted to raise. I just wanted to think that I think Malthusianism is kind of the slander that was thrown at the beginning of modern environmentalist movement. I think the names Aldo Leopold, the other name I looked up, Rachel Carson, these sort of people in the West kind of, it's more about the relationship responsibilities with nature than they kind of the class structure. So to define environmentalism, you can define it kind of, at least in this modern form, a bit more separate from the class structure. But you kind of raised back this point already, so I don't want to spend. No, it's fine, it's good. But then in terms of kind of where the middle class fits in, I think it doesn't necessarily fit in homogenously, but I do think one could argue, I guess, again, to touch a bit on the points you made about this kind of the middle class, not necessarily being the tool, but being kind of, they kind of, by being in a comfortable lifestyle, they disengage from the struggle that the poor people are suffering, and they kind of have enough luxuries to be able to look past the problems that other people are suffering, but also some of the things that they might not even realize is out there, stuff that's kind of not to try too far into future, but kind of the illusion of choice in the voting setup and this sort of thing. Fun fact, FDP are currently polling below 5%. So they're doing very bad right now. This off the example. The German one.
Yeah.
Oh, you're from oh, yeah. We're not. Yeah, it's important. But then to bring just the third point back, it's something we talked about before about separating the art from the artist, and kind of the way we engage with people who might be in the middle class and not like be struggling to, or just feeling disengaged and like they don't have to engage in this sort of like, more in-depth politics, so to speak. I think a tool that I would like to see used more, instead of sort of trying to separate the art from artist, which we can argue about that a bit. I'm honestly not quite sure where I stand on that, so and I haven't thought about it much. But there's the idea of the ideological Turing test. Are you familiar with this? So it's essentially, if you're familiar with the Turing test, you try to prove that if you can't tell what you're talking to is a computer or a human, then it's a lie, or the word to use. What the ideological Turing test is, if you're talking to a person and they can't tell whether it's your ideology or not, then you're kind of able to at least, not necessarily, you don't hold this ideology, you can empathize or understand the reasoning how they got there. And I think this is a tool that would help people kind of properly explore the political space. I think this sort of reasoning and stuff is, I don't want to use the term deficient because it sounds very mean. It's not exactly their fault, but I think a lot of the middle class, many places, kind of doesn't see the need for this sort of tool to try and they think of a few small issues that relate strongly to emotionally or something, and then they kind of discard the rest as kind of casualties along the way. So I think this sort of more holistic understanding of the reasons where people are coming from would help kind of build a bit of a better debate. Touch back on that point. Really. I'm sorry for taking away from that more recent point, but I just thought this was the way when you talk about kind of separating art from art, I thought this was kind of a really important point. I raised my hand instead of jumping in, so I missed.
Maybe we could to build on that. Let's link it back to what you said about middle class. And this,
yeah,
it's a really good question. I was like,
it is a good question.
I was linking into what you're saying. I think one where my head goes about is Antonio Gramsci. As you were mentioning earlier about the large middle class in Europe is doing quite well. In that regard, I think a lot about Antonio Gramsci recently. He's an Italian Marxist in the 1920s and 1930s in Italy. And he was active in late 1920s, early 1920s in Turin, when it looked like there was going to be a revolution, but because of the massive issues after the war, massive poverty, hunger in the streets, they thought this is the perfect ideal conditions of a revolution, but the revolution never came. The people didn't revolt. And he spent afterwards starting to think about this. Why do they come? And I think I think it's very fair to say, the current crisis is currently impacting a lot more people every single year. We're already at 5 billion deaths globally. Every summer you have an overshoot of elderly people dying in Switzerland, middle class here in Switzerland. The impacts are coming. But I think as you were saying, there's not really a consciousness amongst the middle class of the sort of more going the low middle class, but especially the working classes, of this sort of like, what is revolutionary politics, what is the means of agency you have the human itself. And one of the reasons, and Gramsci said this as well, is because people currently comes from this capitalist system, right? And Gramsci called it cultural hegemony, right? So the capitalist doesn't just have control of the means of production, they also have cultural hegemony. They control newspapers, they control the media, they control the center of discourse and what is rational, what is irrational thought. So if you come with something, an idea, threatens their power, you are labeled irrational, you are labeled a loon, you are labeled a murderer, you are labeled Malthusian, which I personally get accused of quite a few times, and I argue these things via Twitter, my favorite medium. And so, you were thrown under the bus there, and one of the things that we have to do, and because people, especially middle class, are afraid of any sort of alternative system, because even having little or having marginal less across Western Europe over the last 20 years, you have people with stagnating real-term salaries, which means they actually earn less now than they did 20 years ago. Not cost of living crisis exploding across Western Europe at the moment, right? But they still don't engage in sort of, let's say, more radical thoughts that could actually provide them with more meat, more security, because of the threats that they sort of face under this current system. It's not fully a question to your point about middle class, but I just think it's a great point to bring it. I think there's a lot of ways to go down.
I wanted to say was that there is a simpler way to look at this dichotomy, working class and the elite class. The dichotomy is how much do you survive, does your living happen because of the labor that you do, right? I mean, like somebody who owns houses, he doesn't need to do any labor. He just owns houses and people pay him rent, and that gives him all his wealth. Whereas somebody who has to show up at work on a regular basis to make their living are working class. The degree of comfort that people have is immaterial. Like a cashier at a supermarket may have lesser comfort, and somebody doing software at a company may have higher comfort. But the broad aspect that you have to show up at work regularly in order to pay your bills is what differentiates working class from the few elites that run the world.
You last notion of social contract, right?
Yeah.
Work and you have if you work for somebody else and get this deal to the I don't know notion I lose my train of thought. Because we're kind of going quite away from environmentalism. So how do we bring it there?
That's very much. I think there's an important point to make, which is to say that if you're talking about the middle class, for instance, not only are they not thinking about how to be radical, they're embracing the most conservative ideology of them all, which is environmentalism. That's the problem. Instead of thinking about how we can consume more, grow our economies, they're thinking not about the creation of wealth, but about the redistribution of it, which is a fundamental mistake in economics. It's called the lump fallacy. And there's a cost of living crisis in Europe. And what do the middle classes want? They want to reduce the amount of meat we can eat, the amount we consume, the amount of times we can have a nice holiday and fly. So the idea is be happy with the limited opportunities you have that are currently and in future shrinking. This kind of idea. And it's what you might want to investigate is Matthew Goodwin's recent book, Voice, Value and Virtues, where he talks about Britain, but it's applicable to the entirety of Europe and the US, where you have, this is maybe Gramsci kind of marginal institutions, where the woke, the environmentalists, they are parts not of the working class, but of the people who can afford to go to university, people in big business, people who are in government, in administration, in the cultural sector, and so on. Not the people who don't have time to spend on Twitter every day. So the point, and they are controlling the ideas and the narrative in a certain sense. It's not them calling others Malthusian, they are calling others racist, climate deniers. For example, Björn Lomborg is regularly slandered as a climate denier, he is not. And that, I think, is interesting because once you investigate that, you can actually find that the very left-wing circles are not in favor of the working class, they're against the working class, they want to make them poorer than they are, keep them in their present poverty. And environmentalism might be called some sort of fusion between left-wing ideology and current capitalism. Because if you look at current capitalism, it's not growing, it's in the late, it's not producing stuff anymore, we're offshoring all our capacity to other countries with deindustrialization, all of that kind of stuff. A knowledge economy is coming up, which the middle class is profiting from. And the point is, well, what kind of superstructure would exist in a capitalist system that is not growing? Well, one that justifies its growth, one that is comfortable, trying to seek to justify the present status quo. Hence, you have environmentalism. And the catastrophe is not coming. And, well, we all know what the Obama thinks, Chris, I think, but deaths from environmental catastrophes and extremes have been going down since industrialization. So,
Thanks for refusing.
I'm not a fan. I'm harsh critic.
Thank you. Learning that environmentalism generates value. So it's not something there that we add on to the effort, but not generate anything and growth. The values, of course, the community and the environment where we feel more comfortable with them. Of course, a lot of us value that biological species are not going to extinction, or at least not as fast, that we have more green areas, that cities are greener, that we have fresher air to breathe. I mean, whatever, right? There's a lot of value in that, actual palpable value that you could define.
Just a question, would you consider green energies as also around here? Yeah. Like wind farms?
For me, yes, because on one hand, yes, it can lead to less, to the extent it will less, of course, called green, and other, let's say, secondary value that they are not limited like fossil energies or localized like fossil energies, which leads to all these geopolitical situations, wars, etc. It is not in the same way. So you could consider that value. So technology rises to a certain level, that's value. Then installations are produced, like generating facility, that's value as well, and produces the energy for people, which is also value. Cars that move around the streets, electric cars, don't give out the exhaust fumes with all the added chemicals that often go with it. Diesel is also very polluting, for example. And that's also a value that in the street you don't have to breathe this stuff anymore, or much less. So, in that sense, I could add a value, I could put a value to that, and to contribution to the quality of life in any given group or an economy. Point I kind of this before, that as middle class and the social contract that we get today, we are just not as desperate as the people were back in the days of Marxism. So, and especially the so-called American dream, that you are in a certain condition of life and you're not happy with what you get. You have this possibility, if you educate yourself, if you take some chances, to improve a lot of yourself and your family, to become part of that higher level, of that higher elite, to control some resources. This was not possible in the time of his peasants, and it's in the time of his factory workers back in the days of Marx. So the appeal of Marx at that time was like, you have no other way out, just go into revolution. That's the only way that your children are not going to die because of hunger, disease, and lack of heating. Like Marx's children, two of his children died, so he had a clear motivation to be resentful of the whole system and how it locked people out into their poverty. But today, that's really an exception, and it's not the rule. So for most people, if they are kind of resentful about not being rich enough or not being comfortable enough, they consider more entrepreneurship, or maybe just working harder, progressing on the job, being nice to their job boss, that they can get promoted earlier, whatever, as a way forward. And in a similar thinking for the environment. So you don't think in terms of revolution, taking chances with your nice life and this comfortable life, but more, doing the recycling, for example. In this way, you are contributing to save the world, right? and maybe give some money to NGOs or whatever, that's also a way to contribute. And you're not going on the streets to fight to sink a tanker, to do whatever is radical activity. Like we have this middle way today, which is appealing, of course, to most people.
I've talked enough. You want to go first?
I just have another question, which maybe kind of fits. I was just reading a little bit of world stuff recently, and I just felt very surprised that it seemed, right, the movement talks all about global north-south divide, and that, right, the people go south, and they are facing problems, and they should be the ones that can progress in a different way. But I was just surprised because that movement was not coming from the global south, if I understood correctly. Barcelona is a big center for it, and because what you're saying is most people here, and I think most people, that's certainly true, they want to stick to this, but then I'm just surprised why this degrowth movement has come not out of the global south, but out of, okay, I don't know exactly what seem more like academic circles in the global north. Maybe there are movements in the global south that they just don't care enough because they don't read their media enough, but
Here we can slow down the economy because we don't have to consume so much.
well, just to struggle for some other path forward.
I think maybe I try to direct answer to that, which was said yesterday. First of all, the fact that it is definitely a very, very, very global north-wide academic movement, and it's one of the biggest critiques at them, and they say it themselves. You know, any sort of degrowth thinker will say we're too wide, it's too academic. You know, it's a massive, massive struggle for that movement. But one of the not but as an exclusive, they said it's a very, very important point. However, one of the sort of key elements of degrowth is that the degrowth movement is a global north movement focused on the global north. You know, one of the key calls to say that we actually need to allow the ecological space for the global south to continue growing, providing services. One of the key issues is right now the current dominant socioeconomic system forcing global south economies to develop extractivist economies, pay off debt primarily, right? But also to supply what the needs are of the global north, right? So one of the needs we need to downscale production in the global north to allow the ecological space for the global south to develop. That's also why it's a very, very north movement and focus on the north. Yeah, but it's definitely way too wide and academic. You know, they have 3 centers: Barcelona, Vienna, and Copenhagen. Copenhagen is going to economy. They just sort of built this center. 3 vacuum centers, 2 Germany, 1 Barcelona. They're spreading. Yeah.
I mean, I think there's more interesting stuff to discuss there, but I was just curious why you were saying that beyond longboard is not a climate study.
Well, I'm not a climate denier. Not a climate change denier, that's all.
It's just contrary to what most people have told me, so I'm curious why you're saying that.
Well, I understand a climate change denier to be someone who is denying, in this context, the reality of global warming. So if you're asking, is global warming occurring? The climate change denier will say no, it is not. But as far as I understand it, Jörn Lundberg does say it is happening. He's just questioning the severity to which it is happening, real severity.
He acknowledges that it's the human
I think so.
change.
I think so, yes it is.
My understanding is that he was questioning how bad it would be at all, just a cost benefit analysis thing, not to get into other. Like I thought that's what his thing, which would by definition not making a climate denier. He's not denying that climate change is happening. He's kind of questioning where the environment, like the need to act on such a. That's how I understood him from the. I would say I haven't read any of his texts in full, but from what I've read of him and about him, that's how I understand his work.
Even agrees with the IPCC report. He just takes it as a given. What they say there is right, and based on that, he builds his theory.
Yes, although he does have a bit of a penchant for citing papers to get retracted, which bothers me.
And he misrepresented IPCC reports.
The FCC refers to acquisitions. The FCC says we need access.
Yeah, but the IPCC misrepresented its own report. This is the difference between the academic version of their reports, which are thousands of pages long, and summary for policymakers, which often contradicts what's in thousands of pages, interestingly enough.
Well, yeah, I guess that's what you get if you put a person in another room trying to get their wording in, right?
Present company excluded.
Yeah.
I think this debate is part of a broader subject, which is historically humans have come up with reasons why power should be accumulated somewhere. And now we have people saying climate change is a very real and time-sensitive matter, and the only way to to articulate a good enough response to it would be through state intervention or through market movement, which is what I believe is your platform would argue for. And I think that the 9/11 was another case of people using an occurrence to get more power and then invade a lot of the tragedies that occurred in the Middle East after that. Some of them were not justified to the best of my knowledge, and I think we should be very skeptical of the duality of this debate. In one side, there's legitimate reasons for which we should act, and which means we should act. That's the debate. And then in other cases, there's just, okay, this is a real thing which is happening, but I don't trust you in that we should invade Iraq. Okay? Maybe using $2 trillion to invade a country which has nothing to do with the originator of the falling of the Twin Towers might have nothing to do with this. But I'm just trying to frame it that, well, this is not only something, this is not something that limits itself to 9/11. Every single time, COVID, any subject, people have used it to say, oh, this is very scary, we should really take over society and use this as a means to reach to higher power. So I should think we should always be skeptical of both sides. So there's always also power-managed people who say, no, everything's fine, nothing happens, and we should just keep pumping out some exams. We should also be skeptical of those people, but the nuance in the debate would come, in my view, to be skeptical of both the people, the poly-managed and the catastrophists.
So you mentioned before that an idea is spreadability of an idea, right? And once you mentioned about 9/11, it's also a strategy to enhance the spreadability of an idea, to create a narrative that connects it into something that everybody can recognize. So I could take AI, for example, which today everybody can recognize, GPT, and create an argument against environmentalism. Just what is that to make that connection to something that everybody can recognize, to spread whatever your idea is. I think we see that with politics as well, that the right thing or left wing can use the same source to justify completely different policies.
Yeah, I feel absorbing of this would be me saying, what do I want? I want the state to subsidize my dogs. Okay, so what has happened recently? Just the conflict in the East, Ukraine versus Russia. I could build a narrative of why the best thing the governments could do is subsidize my dogs, because that's a solution to the problem.
If I think
Feel something about the East, then you can agree.
The question of, okay, how severe or the impact of climate change will be, how severe should we intervene? I mean, okay, that's probably a question you can answer with science to a certain degree, okay, so the scientific method is one of the more objective methods to answer questions that are about environmental impacts and also perhaps of the economic cost of it. And economists also use the scientific method, I guess. And so, okay, so there are different ideologies, even like, I mean, science, there's always a normative element to science as well, for sure. But then you probably can the best way to say you have to find like to the consent agreement and how to act would be probably resting more the